I am joined by my co-hosts, Kim Lantis
Hello.
in Hermosillo, Mexico, and Carlos Ponce in Mexico City. And we have our guest, Jeff Koffman, who's chiming in from London, UK. Hey, Jeff, welcome to the show.
Good morning over there.
Jeff is an Emmy Award-winning war correspondent, so we're going to get to know you a little bit and talk about what it's been like to transition from a journalist career to becoming an entrepreneur. But before we do that, Jeff, please introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
So, I kind of only half-jokingly call myself the accidental entrepreneur. When I was a kid, I had one career I wanted to pursue, and that was journalism. And that's what I did for 30 years. I started in Canada at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and in local TV, and then made my way up to national television, and then moved to New York with CBS Evening News, and then after that, to Miami, covering the southern U.S. and Latin America with ABC News, and then came over here to London, England in 2011 as ABC News London correspondent. In the bucket list of life, I'm a lucky guy. I've reported from more than 40 countries. I have seen both the best and the worst of the world as a war correspondent covering the Iraq War, the Arab Spring in Libya, covering revolutions and coups in Latin America, Haiti and elsewhere, but also doing some really interesting, sometimes cool stuff, going to the Galapagos to do a documentary. I mean, wow, that was really a thrill. And I loved being a journalist. And candidly, I think the thing for me that's interesting about talking to you is that I never imagined myself doing anything else. It was just in my DNA. And I kind of thought they'd carry me out of the newsroom feet first when I died, because that's what I like doing. But, after a couple of years, after 30 years, even if you love something, you begin to realize you don't need to do it till you die, that it's okay to change horses. And I just kind of felt like there was a certain sameness to what I was doing. I wasn't interested in doing celebrity news, and I just felt like something wasn't as exciting for me and challenging in a way that I wanted. And I kind of stumbled into what I'm doing now. If you told me 10 years ago, Jeff, you're going to get into tech, you're going to be an entrepreneur, an inventor, run a startup, I would have bet you a lot of money at very favorable odds that there's no way that would happen.
So, Jeff, it sounds as though you've traded the literal trenches, war trenches, for another set of trenches, which is kind of what it's described often to get into the startup space. You're now in a new set of trenches, fighting through the process of building that business. Tell us a little bit about Trint. What gave birth to the idea? What is it all about?
So I didn't know it at the time, but I fit a kind of classic mid-late stage entrepreneur's profile. I'm solving a problem that I lived intimately. I'm not trying to reinvent the taxi industry, which I know nothing about except that I've been in taxis. I'm not trying to reinvent food delivery. I am a journalist. I spent my life producing stories with video and audio content based on interviews, speeches, news conferences. And, so when I started in Canada in the 80s, we were shooting on videotape. I literally, I don't want to sound like a dinosaur, but I actually wrote my first stories on typewriters, which I know like a whole bunch of people are going to go, wow, he must be really old. I don't think I'm that old. So, but clearly I lived a different paradigm. But my point is that I watched everything move from analog video to digital video to disc to memory card to the technologies we have and the connectivity of the internet. The whole way information is gathered and disseminated has been utterly transformed in the arc of my career and my lifetime. The one thing that didn't change was transcription and how we actually got at the content. Since the cassette recorder was invented in the 1960s and started to become ubiquitous in the 1970s, it was you record the interview, it's something like this conversation, you rewind at the top, you hit play, you hit stop, and you type it out. You hit play, you hit stop, and you type it out. And I bet a lot of listeners are nodding their heads going, yep, been there, done that. Did it for my university research, did it for my marketing research, did it for my freelance writing, whatever. But that is how, you can't write your story, whether it's for text, a text story, a radio story, or a podcast, or a video story, if you don't have the precise words of what people are saying. And so transcription is the kind of bottleneck in the workflow. And it's the tedious part. It's the, oh God, why did I let that interview go so long? And you'd think I'd have learned in 30 years, but I think being slightly too curious in life, I always loved talking to people, and you'd come back to me and go, I only needed 15 seconds for World News or Good Morning America, and why did I interview this person for 20 minutes? Now I've got to go through and find the right 15 seconds. And so the question that I asked, I was teaching an overseas journalism program for Indiana University here in London, and for my alma mater in Canada, Queen's University, two different programs. And a friend of mine said, "Oh, if you're teaching journalism, you should come with me to MozFest and see where the cutting edge of media innovation is happening. It's an open source conference run by Mozilla every year here in London." So he took me, and I had never been in a room full of developers before. And it was, candidly, I'm not easily intimidated, but seeing a lot of code on the wall is pretty intimidating if you've never been around it. Anyway, I met some guys who'd done some work with audio and text. And I kind of innocently asked the question, if speech to text is so good, I can't use it. Why can't I leverage it to do the dirty work of my content, which is transcription? And that led to the question, well, what do you mean you can't use it? Why not? And the answer is because, well, speech to text, automated speech to text, natural language processing is almost accurate. Those mistakes are fatal. And there was at the time no way to kind of check for where it's right and where it's wrong without getting back to the source audio and then looking at the text and then, sort of twisting yourself into a pretzel to figure it out. And that's where Trint was born. Trint was the answer. And they had done something that made me think, well, if you could do that, why not add on to this? And couldn't you do this and that? And I didn't really, at that point, I honestly wasn't thinking of founding a startup. I was just curious to know whether it was possible. So, I was still at ABC News, and we kind of kept in touch by Skype. And I sent them some interviews, and we tried some stuff. And one of the guys is a really brilliant hacker, and he knocked something together. And it just was like a light bulb moment. It was like, I said, this isn't quite right, but this could be. And I think we've just invented the future. And I literally said to them, I remember on this Skype call, because none of them were in London. They were all dotted across Europe, the three of them. I said, listen, we don't know each other, but either we try to make this happen, or we go our separate ways and never see each other. And I guarantee you, in a couple of years, you're going to walk into a Starbucks and somebody's going to be on a version of what we're looking at. And I don't think we should do that. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. If I had known how steep this mountain is, I'm not sure I'd have had the courage. But it was just kind of, I knew that the world needed it. And I didn't know whether we could do it, but I knew that I had an understanding of the problem space. And that is a huge competitive advantage when you're solving a problem in the marketplace. If you've actually lived the problem, you know what the solution has to look like. I mean, what I've learned as we've grown is that my scenario was not the only one, but the fundamental sort of starting point was that I understood what it had to look like for me to use it. And my theory was if it worked for me, it would work for other journalists. And if it worked for journalists, it would work for academic researchers, marketing researchers, social science researchers, and anybody who's working with the spoken word.
Exactly. Let's talk a little bit about this problem space and this steep mountain that you're climbing. Why is it important? Why is the speech to text universe so
here's the way I put it. I grew up as a kid in my early career in the 20th century in what I describe as a text-driven economy. Newspapers on print. We wrote postcards when we traveled. Our parents or grandparents sent telegrams and telexes. magazines came on shiny paper. We read text. We communicated by text. We wrote our, university papers on paper, etc. We now live not in the text economy of the 20th century, but in the voice economy of the 21st century. If you think back to the 1980s and 90s, people like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs came along and invented the word processor. And for those of us who are writers, it was an emotional experience to be liberated from typing, because you could think in a nonlinear fashion, you could move words around, you could search words, etc. That was the text-driven economy going digital. We need a similar fluidity, sort of navigability, discoverability with audio, with content like this. So say I mention polar bears and climate change. Okay, somebody wants to search that. They're not going to find it in this podcast in this conversation, because it's not searchable. With Trint, suddenly, because the audio and the text are aligned, because we take the machine-generated speech-to-text transcription and glue it to the source audio word for word, you can search polar bear or climate change and find 15 minutes, 10 minutes into this conversation, that's where Jeff talked about it. Instead of having to scrub through the entire thing to, that's where the reference is to polar bears. And ultimately, that allows you to put it on the internet and make it discoverable. So this is a whole new language for a whole new era of communication. And that's really the goal here, is to create a tool set for the 21st century voice economy. And when I say voice, I mean audio and video.
That's interesting. As you're talking, I'm thinking, I've seen several videos, interviews, or just clips reposted over and over by the same influencers or content generators, right? And it makes sense, right? If you can't search or index or find the content by using text search, then the only thing you have is to keep reposting it. And it makes me wonder why there's millions and millions of pieces of audio and video that could be searchable and indexed and curated in such a way that I wouldn't have to repost things every 6 weeks, for example, to make it relevant again. So how does Trint solve that? Who are you targeting as your customer base to solve that problem?
So Tullio, let me start with where you begin, which is this discoverability and searchability issue. I think of spoken word that sits on a file, or that sits in an archive as a vault with no door. It is what I call dark data. Meaning, if you put this on your website without an associated transcript, 2 years from now, somebody comes to Dojo and says, what did that guy Koffman say? Well, either they listen to it or they pass over it. And that means that the potential value, assuming I say anything of value, is completely passed over. And candidly, not in this circumstance perhaps, but in other circumstances, if you're, ABC News where I worked and I did a half-hour interview and only used a short amount, I might be able to repurpose it. I might be able to monetize it. They might be able to sell it, all sorts of things, but it's too expensive. What we do at Trint with that dark data is shed light on it. We make it easily searchable and discoverable. And that's the key here. That's what the world needs. We need an easy way to find the words that are spoken. Just as on a text document with Google, I can search polar bears and climate change and find a whole bunch of documents around there. And if I know that I want National Geographic, I can put that in my search term too. And I bet I can find some stuff in Nat Geo on polar bears and climate change. But try to find that in a documentary or a podcast, and you're not going to come up with it. That's what needs to change.
I think it's really important, Tool, or correct me if I'm wrong, to validate videos and what is said, especially now with social media. And you mentioned, this 15-second clip. But if we're not getting the full clip or the full context, it can be very easy to construe this and make what someone said seem like something that they weren't really saying. And so if we can't easily find that full context of that full video to watch it, but maybe we could type in what they said and then boom, here's the video that it links to, here's the actual text, here's the context of what they're saying. I think as a journalist, is this something that you value greatly?
Well,
the ability
of course,
to validate?
I mean, even before so-called fake news, a term which you know, I don't even want to get in there into that.
Kim is suggesting we all be empowered to become fact checkers. I love that. Actually, I can actually put in that clip and it'll find the original content and validate what the context of it was.
In the translation,
That's
almost can be fatal.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, and that is, it's about the veracity, the authenticity, and it's about being able to very quickly search and verify, correct if necessary, because that's the point of the Trint editor. It's an interactive editor. If there's a mistake, you can quickly correct it, and you know you can trust your transcript. You know you've got it right. And yes, you can say to me, well, did he say it another way? Oh, look, found it. Here it is, etc. So yes, suddenly the spoken word becomes navigable, and that's really the tool set that we're building. Tulio, you asked who are the users? You know, I can coyly say anybody with a mobile phone or a laptop, because we're all storytellers now. We're ultimately about telling stories in some form, and that may be stories for journalists or brand journalism, which is a huge sector. Every major brand now does video and audio podcasting, the internal communications through video and audio, so and external communications. You know, think of Red Bull, for example, which has made a huge industry out of that. But every company is doing a version of that, if not quite on the scale of Red Bull. So it's about storytellers, but storytellers, as I say, can be anyone from you know, a lawyer doing discovery to an academic doing social science research, to a marketing person saying, why do you fly this airline and not that airline, etc. And all of those people are searching for the same thing. They're searching for the moments that matter in a longer piece of content to tell a story.
So how does it work? Is it an app that anyone can use? And in other words, how do you go and find the content, swift through it, translate it, and then make it searchable? Is this something that someone needs to license on a per blog basis, like on their own site, or is this more universal? Can you walk us through how it works? How do I use it as a technology platform?
Tulio, when we first launched this, we got these incredibly emotional love letters and tweets and we still do from time to time, from users saying, how do you do this? Is this real? Are there people doing this? Because it took, now it comes back very quickly, but in 2016, when we first launched it, September 2016, it could take 10, 20 minutes to come back. And, you know, I had this image of people typing furiously, and, you know, a sentence each to put it together. Listen, we're leveraging the increasingly commoditized technologies of automated speech to text, which have made massive strides in the last 10, 20 years. You couldn't have done this 15 or 20 years ago. There just wasn't, people will tolerate a certain error rate, but there's a point at which they'll say, this is garbage, it's too much work. That, I didn't know it. I wish I could say it was my vision, but you know, I happened to be that surfer out in the ocean, catching a wave just as it was forming. And you know, I didn't know it, that at the time, that speech to text, probably when we started working on this in December 2014, was just at the point where it was maturing to be good enough to be taken seriously in the form that we're using it. If you had tried it in, I'm guessing, 2010 or 2008, it probably would have been too inaccurate to be useful, and you'd say this is a waste of time. So, and since then, it's made huge strides. What you do is you take an audio video file, and we also do live, but you upload it, and then, you know, minutes later you get back this transcript on the Trint editor, which is what we call a web app, meaning that it's on your browser at Trint.com. You sign up. There's a free trial for 7 days, and then it's a monthly access fee, which offers you a number of uploads or unlimited transcription. And the reason for that is that we're not just a transcription tool. We began as that, but we've invested a huge amount in innovation. We now do translation. We allow collaboration of teams. So the three of us can be talking from 3 different places, and like Google Docs, we can be working on the same transcript, sending comments, highlighting moments, exporting them, et cetera, in the same way. And so little did we know that this is a product that foresaw lockdown and remote working, so effectively, which is why we're not only holding our own, but thriving, under these really challenging circumstances, because this allows people to work from their home. Associated Press, one of our biggest clients, said to me a couple of months ago, I don't know how we would have done this without Trint. It is saving us. And so, it's really exciting. I had an idea. I don't know. I didn't really know where it was going to take me, but I guess, when you've lived the problem, you kind of have a gut feeling of what the solution that this is not just me. We all hated transcribing, everybody does. And, I for a long time, we used to give out a swag at conferences, little candy pills that looked like Tylenol, and we called them transcription relief. And people laughed. They cost nothing to make, and they were the most effective swag, because people said, you guys got a sense of humor. I hate transcription. I need these. Can I take a few to give to my colleagues?
I think it's interesting how most people will see the end result, right? They watch a journalist covering a story, and they see that 15, 30-second, 60-second clip, and they think that's all that there is. They just did it and it's over. They don't realize how much work goes behind the scenes to actually get that into production. Same thing with actors, right? You think, oh, it's such an awesome thing. They just show up and do a scene, but they do that take like 4, 6, 7, 8 different times in different angles, and it's a lot of work. So it's interesting that we often take for granted all the things that go on in the background that are very time-consuming, and frankly, it's not fun work. Transcribing your own interview, trying to remember exactly what was said, versus using technology to do that sounds like a fantastic solution for journalists and alike. So let's talk a little bit about your company and how it's evolved over the years. Where are you now in terms of your market share? Are you predominantly in the UK, in the US? Are you global,
it's a funny thing.
Language?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. Here I am sitting in London, England, and our market is the US. I mean, we're in English, and gosh, I don't even know now, 30-something languages, every major language, whether it's from Russian to Mandarin to Arabic, all the European languages, a lot of smaller languages, or less common languages. We also translate. We won a 300,000 euro grant from Google's European Digital News Innovation Fund in 2018, I guess it was, to build a translation tool, which we launched last year, which takes conversations like this and we'll turn it into Spanish, Italian, French, German, whatever you want. So we're a platform that does much more. But so the company itself began as 4 people, and I guess we hovered around 8 or 10 for those first early years of bootstrapping, as I kind of made it up and had no idea, just sort of stumbled from one mistake to another, and I don't know, to do this. I don't know whether you were a kid, as a kid, you had one of those punching bags, Popeye punching bags or whatever, that with sand in the bottom that, your parents blew up, and you punched it as a sort of 4-year-old and it would bounce back up and you'd laugh and you'd knock it over. That's kind of,
yeah, like the training tool.
Right. Well, and it's kind of like what it is to be an entrepreneur, particularly a first-time entrepreneur. You make mistakes, you make stupid mistakes, you go, how did I do that? And, and people say no to you all the time, and you just have to keep bouncing back up. I mean, resilience and tenacity, I call it humble overconfidence. I think that's sort of the kind of oxymoron of that is actually the reality of my journey, and I think a lot of entrepreneurs' journey. You need humility, but you also need overconfidence, because this is really hard. And I wouldn't even want to tell you how many people have said no to me over the years, whether it's funding or can you do this, or or can you defend this, or can it scale? And you just have to kind of let go and go, okay, but I'm not going to listen to you. Because otherwise you'd fold up your tent and go home, and I don't know what I'd have done. You just have to believe. And I think, for me, that really is the key. I think that they're the three things that I think have been key for my journey as an entrepreneur to make Trint what it is: our vision, seeing what this can do, passion, the drive to do it, and the drive to bring others along, and authenticity, the humility and the honesty to say, this is what I don't know, help me, and to allow people to say that around you in the company and the people you work with. And I think that the rest you can either learn or hire. And at this point, Trint is now 75 people. We are in Toronto with about 14 or 15 and about 60 here in London. And we are hiring, at least another 25 before the end of the year. We will have doubled the company since March. And we have plans to grow beyond that because the market really, really is demanding the tool we have and the innovations that we have planned. And so it's pretty complicated, actually. I feel like I didn't know it, but I could be writing startups for dummies, because I feel like I've lived my own journey. How to survive your own stupid mistakes and bad advice and good advice and confusing advice. That's what this journey is about.
Well, it sounds like you have stuck with it and it's paying off. So congratulations, and definitely the timing for what you're doing is very appropriate. I want to just quickly, as we wrap up, there's a lot of people that have been impacted by COVID-19 financially in the recent 6 months. Some who have been in the same careers for 20, 30 years, finding themselves struggling to get back into that track. You obviously made a huge pivot, right? You went from a journalist to an entrepreneur, and you say it's an accidental change, but that's a typical story for a lot of entrepreneurs. They try to solve a problem that they were facing and end up building a business. But if those who are sitting on the fence, afraid to make the transition from something they've loved dearly for their entire lives, like you said, I didn't imagine myself ever doing this. What would be your words of advice right now for those sitting watching this saying, man, I might need to consider making a change? What are some things you would advise them to do?
It's a really interesting question. I would say that a couple of things. First of all, this is I think that if you go into this fearing failure, you won't succeed. I think in my book, the definition of failure is not trying. And if you feel, if you feel that success is the only thing that matters, you're not going to enjoy the journey. And no matter what the outcome of a risk of an entrepreneurial venture, if you actually put your heart into it, you will be a richer, smarter person. Maybe not financially richer, but seriously, it's not just about the money. I mean, of course, there's a pot of gold at the end of every rainbow with a startup. But if that's the only thing that motivates you, I wouldn't invest in you. If you don't believe in what you're doing, if you're not committed to the journey, if you're not excited by the journey, forget it. If you have that in your bones, if you have an idea, then that's great. That you should pursue it and not be afraid of failing, because God knows I should be failing. Don't tell the investors that. And I would say, for me, as someone with no financial background, no business training, couldn't really am not able to operate Excel even now. Thankfully, our finance team can. I can kind of read a balance sheet now. But don't ask me to explain what some of the terminology is. But I'm shameless about asking stupid questions. It's what reporters have to do in order to survive. You can't fake it on air, on ABC or CBS, or you'll get caught and you'll get hung out to dry. But I would say that it is harder than I ever imagined. It is more fun than I ever imagined, and it is more creative than I ever imagined. And I think those three things, if you like a challenge, if you want to be excited, particularly, I started this in my 50s. The idea, so many of the people who I grew up with are sort of thinking of retiring. I'm definitely not retired. This was, I don't know, 60 to 70 hours a week in the first years. It's not quite as overwhelming now because we've got a really smart leadership team and team in general who carry a lot of the burden and who do a lot of the stuff that I should never have been doing. But if the idea excites you, go for it. And I think it's unbelievable how, to your question, Tulio, reinventing yourself is an incredibly healthy, exciting thing to do when you feel like you're coasting. And so, don't be afraid. I would say one thing about people contemplating entrepreneurship, because a lot of people, when you do what I've done, when we used to go to parties, not anymore, of course, in lockdown, but there is a kind of line that would make my eyes slightly roll, if not publicly, metaphorically, when people say, "Oh, I've got an idea for a startup." I would say 9 out of 10 of them don't. They think they do, because the bottom line is, if you have an idea for a startup, is it really a problem that the world needs solving? And is it really a solution that the world is prepared to pay for, not just once, but consistently? Because there are a lot of things you could invent and do, but they're not necessarily viable businesses. And I think people who haven't done this sometimes misunderstand the idea that something creative, something new is by definition a good idea for a startup. I think that the kind of, you see, I'm talking like a business guy. See how much I've learned, but can it be monetized? Is it scalable and repeatable? Those are the things that investors want to know, and with good reason, because if people are going to pay you $10 once, you're not going to have a business. And I see this time and again. I have friends who've done startups, people who I've gotten to know in the startup community, and their businesses kind of stall because they get a lot of users paying $10 and then they disappear, and then they've got to get more. It costs you more to get the user than it does to take their money, than the money they pay you. That's not a startup. So you have to ask yourself tough questions. But if the drive is there, this is a fantastic, exhausting, but really thrilling adventure.
Well, Jeff, it's been a pleasure to have you with us. We wish you a lot of luck and success, and thank you for joining us. I know it's getting a little later there in London. Thanks for being with us, and come back tomorrow. We have one more show on Wednesday and on Thursday. I think that Carlos had a little trouble with his internet, so I'm going to try to bring up the topics coming up really quickly. Let's see what we got coming up tomorrow. We have Randy Wooden tomorrow, who's the Chief Strategy Officer at Seismic. He's the ex-CEO of Percolate, who got acquired by Seismic. We're going to be talking about aligning sales and marketing teams during times of change. I've known Randy since 2004. He's a great guy, multiple exits. Looking forward to speaking with him. And then, of course, the day after on Thursday, we have Scott Ford, who's the CEO and co-founder of Gogi Bytes, and we're going to be talking about communication, just as important as code. So looking forward to those interviews. Come back again tomorrow at 1 p.m. Pacific and on Thursday at 1 p.m. Pacific. Until then, stay safe, everyone. Just stay with us as we wrap up.
Thank you.
Thanks.